Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Mundy. I'm Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation at the Union League of Philadelphia on beautiful South Broad Street in the heart of Center City. Great place to be. All right, last week, if you tuned in, you heard the story about Philadelphia, the Union League, and the Titanic, which sank on April the 14th and 15th of 1912. A part owner of the Titanic was a Philadelphian and a Union League member named Peter A.B. Widener, right? And I thought Widener was such an interesting story. We'll talk about him this week. So here we go. All right. Peter A.B. Widener was born on November the 13th of 1834 in Philadelphia, when Philadelphia was that little 2-square-mile city that we know that went between the Delaware and the Schuylkill Rivers, east to west, and Vine Street on the north, South Street on the south, right? His parents were German immigrants. His father, Johannes, was a brickmaker and a butcher. Peter had a brother who was also a butcher, and that's where he got his apprenticeship, because Peter was not going to graduate from high school even at this point in time. But he learned to be a really good butcher, to the extent that during the American Civil War, 1861 through 1865, Peter somehow finagled a contract with the Union Army to supply all Union soldiers within a 10-mile radius of Philadelphia with mutton. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers, so that was a good deal. So Peter would realize $50,000 from that deal with the Union Army. And being the entrepreneur that he was about to become, he would start to use the money wisely. Now, in the meantime, in 1858, he married Josephine Dunton, and they would have 2 sons, George Dunton Widener, the oldest, and then Joseph Early Widener, the younger. And we know that George D. would go down on the Titanic with his son, Harry, Peter A.B.'s grandson, so a different part of the story. All right, so after the Civil War, Peter takes his money and opens up a chain of butcher shops. So he's got this entrepreneurial spirit, and he's going to make some money, right? And what do entrepreneurs do with money? They make it grow. They want more of it. And so being a son of the city, and keep in mind that in 1854, the city itself, the act of consolidation, combined the city and the county. So now Philadelphia is that 130 square mile city that we think of today in the 21st century. Lots of space, lots of room. So it's a big city. And it's also becoming America's major industrial city. It already was before the war, even more so after the war. And that's important because after his butcher shops, Peter Widener would branch out into what were called street railways. Right? And the first noticeable street railway was organized in Philadelphia in 1853, and it ran on Market Street from West Philadelphia down to Center City, basically where City Hall is today. All right, and it was a commuter line, basically. But after the Civil War, though, as the industrialization takes place and the city begins to expand, and by 1867, there are 4,500 single-family homes being built a year in the city to house this industrial workforce. Well, these laborers have to get to work somehow, and that was street railways. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about a horse-drawn omnibus or carriage that could hold 10, 15, 20 people that would ride on rails down the middle of the street. And very often these streets were just dirt, maybe if you're lucky, cobbled or bricked. All right. During the Civil War, there were 129 miles of railway lines, and that number would grow and grow and grow. So we're now in the early 1870s. All right, Widener's starting to invest money in these street railways because he sees them as the way to make some more money. He also thought city politics would be a way to make money, and then in the 19th century, it was probably a very good way to make money. All right, because eventually Philadelphia, by the turn of the 20th century, was known as corrupt and contented because everybody was making money and it didn't matter who you were. All right. So he became city treasurer in 1871. He thought he would run for mayor in 1874 against the incumbent mayor, William Stokely, also a member of the league, but decided he wouldn't win. So he backed out of city politics, but kept his connections, as you can imagine, as they would become very important when you're trying to own street railways in the city. So he also met another young entrepreneur in Philadelphia named William Lucan Elkins. Elkins was a greengrocer during the Civil War, and like Widener had a knack for entrepreneurship, and he opened up a series of greengroceries after the war, and he's making money. And he also somehow knew John D. Rockefeller, all right? And so Elkins would be in on the ground floor of the creation of Standard Oil Corporation in 1875, and he would be on the board of directors. And these two entrepreneurs became really good. They became best friends. All right, they would be best friends for the rest of their lives. Actually, they would live across the street from each other. They would be buried across from each other. So that's how good that relationship was. And so with that relationship, Elkins and Widener became known as the Traction Twins because they were buying up all the street railways in Philadelphia. By 1883, they consolidated into the Philadelphia Traction Company, then the Union Traction Company, then the Philadelphia Rapid Traction Company. All right, and we get bigger and bigger and bigger. By 1880, we're talking close to 300 miles of street railway lines. All right, still horse-drawn, by the way. All right. In 1885, 117 million Philadelphians used the street railways. 117 million people a year. Phenomenal. All right. So they're making money there. They're making money in other places as well. And another good place to make money, as we just learned besides Standard Oil, was going to be in railroads, because Philadelphia had the country's two largest railroads, the Philadelphia and Reading Company, and then the Pennsylvania Railroad, which by 1882 was America's largest railroad. It was the world's largest railroad, and it was the world's largest corporation. Widener was never on the board there, but he knew all the board members, specifically Clement Atkin Griscom, his partner, who helped eventually create the IMM that led to the Titanic. So go back and watch that last week's episode to get more on that story. So Widener is well connected now, and he is just making money hand over fist. All right, with all these through these different corporate endeavors of his. But you're making all this money, you have to live in a nice house, right? So in 1887, Widener hired another Philadelphia architect and Union League member named Willis Hale, Hale, to build his first major mansion on the northwest corner at Broad and Girard Streets in North Philadelphia. That's where all the nouveau money was going. It was going north, right? The residence, it was phenomenal for its day. Even the bathroom fixtures were plated in 24-karat gold, so you can imagine how opulent this building was, and eccentric, because that was Hale. And who lived across the street? You guessed it, William Lukens Elkins himself. Right? He was on the northeast corner. Right? So there is the economic power in the city of Philadelphia. All right? Interesting, isn't it? All right. Now, of course, they're making so much money that they both wanted bigger and better houses, and they moved to the suburbs, specifically a neighborhood that was then known as Ashbourne. Today, we think of it as Elkins Park, after William Elkins. Surprise, surprise. All right. So Widener would hire the up-and-coming Gilded Age architect in Philadelphia named Horace Trumbauer, who would also become a member of the Union League. And he would build something called Linwood Hall on Ashbourne Road, still there to this day, and it's worth a visit to see this house. It is spectacular, even in its decay. 110 rooms, right? 55 bedrooms, a ballroom big enough for 1,000 people, outside swimming pool, gardens, a racetrack, right? 300 acres worth of ground, big stuff. Now, the building itself is shaped like a T. 55 bedrooms, but what do you do with the other space? You fill it up with art, because you can't have a big house without a big art collection. That's part of the Gilded Age. It's a requirement. And Widener would create one of the greatest private art collections in America by the time he died in 1915. All right? It had all the great Italian masters. You know, you can think of Botticelli, you can think of Raphael, Donatello, you can think of the old masters themselves, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Rembrandt. They were all there. Think of the great French Impressionists, Renoir, Degas, Monet, Corot in the collection. He had the great English painters as well, Constable, Reynolds, Gainsborough, Turner. I mean, there wasn't an artist that wasn't this collection itself. And it wasn't just art, it was also decorative arts, things like tapestries, because they were very popular in the 19th century, early 20th century. He also had what would become probably the greatest collection of Chinese porcelain in America. Close to 2,000 items in this collection altogether. Most importantly, perhaps, or interesting, but not interesting, actually 2 self-portraits that were painted in the early 20th century by the greatest Gilded Age portrait artist in America, John Singer Sargent. So there are 2 portraits. Both would eventually hang in Linwood Hall, right? Today, one of them is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but the other is at the National Gallery of Art, which is eventually where the Widener family, the majority of the family art collection would go in 1942, donated through his son Joseph. So, so here we are. We're up in Linwood Hall. Just spectacular building. And what would happen next? Okay, let's see. As I mentioned, Elkins lived across the street in houses, the Elkins family, because one of his sons, George, also lived on the property there, and they were in houses also built by Horace Trumbauer. So you can see how that connection would go on. All right. Okay, so Widener is just, at this point, it's the late 1890s, early 20th century. He has become a friend of J.P. Morgan, right? Can't hurt knowing J.P. Morgan. And so Widener would become one of Morgan's partners, and as he begins to create some of the greatest 20th century American industries that we know, specifically U.S. Steel, all right, that great conglomerate. Widener would be on the ground floor of that, stockholder, board of director. All right, he also knew James Duke, who was New York at this point in time, but from North Carolina, and Duke is developing the American Tobacco Company. Widener gets on the ground floor of that. So through all these connections, he's just becoming wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. And at this point, he is the wealthiest man in Philadelphia, right? So what happens next? It's 1912, all right? The International Mercantile Marine Company, in which he is a 20% partner, all right, with J.P. Morgan and some British partners, okay? They own the Titanic, which, as we've heard, would hit the iceberg on April the 14th. It would founder on April the 15th, and down with it went one of his two sons, George D. Widener, and George's son, Harry, who was a recent college graduate. Both of them were Union League members. Harry, they all worked in the family business and things like that. At this point, it is a family empire, and it was such a big empire that the Widener family actually built a building, which is still there on Chestnut Street, just off the southeast corner of City Hall. Oh, surprise, surprise! Wonder why it's there. All right, no accident, I'm sure. All right, but this was the death blow, if you will, for Peter Widener. His wife had died a few years before. He's a bachelor. He loses his son and his grandson, and literally his health would never recover, and he would die 3 years later, on November the 6th of 1915. And when he died as one of the wealthiest men in America. American Heritage did a survey of wealthy Philadelphians in the late 1990s, and they estimated that he would have come out as the 29th wealthiest man in America within the state, worth $35 billion, right? So there's still a lot of Widener money around, okay? The most famous Widener relative or descendant, perhaps in the 20th century, is one that we probably all know. He's more of our contemporary, and that was Fitzeugene Dixon, whose mother, Eleanor, was the daughter of George and Eleanor Widener. Okay, the George went down on the Titanic, all right? So he inherited a lot of Widener money on his own. Another Harvard graduate, like his grandfather. And he would become most famous in Philadelphia for being a sports entrepreneur, and he would become at one point a part-time or minority owner in, I think, the 76ers, the basketball team, the Flyers, the ice hockey team, and the Philadelphia Phillies, the baseball team. Don't think he ever got involved with the Eagles. He also became very well known for having purchased the Robert Indiana sculpture, the Love sculpture, that he then gave to the city, and that has become the cornerstone piece of what is now Love Park, just off the northwest corner of City Hall itself. All right. Fitzeugene Dixon served on the board of the Pennsylvania Military College for many, many years, and in 1972, the college changed its name to Widener University in honor of Fitzeugene's mother and grandmother, both Eleanors. So the Widener name also continues through a school that was founded actually by Peter A.B. Widener in the early 20th century, 1901, 1902. It was known as the Widener School for Crippled Children, designed by Horace Trumbauer, no surprise. But it basically brought in Olney avenues in the northeast section of Philadelphia. And that school is still there and working, going strong, from what I understand. So there's another Widener who's a really interesting character, who I don't think anybody would recognize today. His name was James Widener Ray, R-A-Y. And he descended through Joseph's side of the family. Joseph and his wife had a daughter named Josephine. She had a daughter named Joan. and Joan was James's mother. And Joan had married James Ray, who was a military man, but had some money on his own. James Widener was born in Santa Barbara, California in 1952, and would never really leave the West Coast. James never married, never had any children, but at the age of 21, he inherited an allowance of $1 million, and he learned how to spend it well. Not always well, sometimes recklessly. He had, like many young men of that age, had problems with alcohol and drugs and mental issues. He was eventually bipolar. He would move to Seattle, where he would have his own epiphany and understand that he had to get his act together. And after his mother died in 1966, he inherited $38 million plus, and he used that money to create a foundation, a nonprofit foundation called the Rainier Institute and Foundation. And it would give money towards needy citizens in the country. Now, keep in mind, the Widener money at this point is based in Philadelphia. The banks, the money managers, the accountants, the lawyers were all based in Philadelphia. So Ray would come back to Philadelphia once a year, at least, to meet with his financial advisors. And one of them introduced him to Sister Mary Scullion and Project Home, as I understand it. And the foundation would then make a large donation of, I think the project that they picked was an $11 million project. They took an abandoned apartment house at 21st and Venango in North Philadelphia and converted it into 53 apartments for the homeless. And it is still functioning today. It is known as the Ray Home. And ironically, perhaps, it is only not even 10 minutes away from Broad and Gerard, where James W. Ray's money all started, if you will. Okay, the home of Peter A.B. Widener. So in a way, I guess we've come full circle on the Widener family. There's tons more to talk about. I barely scratched the surface, but we'll do that some other time. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a fascinating story. And I hope you tune in next week. We'll see what we talk about. It'll be a surprise. So in the meantime, stay well, stay healthy, and stay safe. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.